Shalom and greetings, friends. I'm recording this message at the end of December 2012 and with January 1st, 2013 just ahead, and most of the world refers it to as a New Year's Day. Now, according to what calendar? Is it our Creator's calendar, or is it a man-made calendar? Now, most of us probably know it's the Gregorian calendar most of us go by today, with the months January through December. And our Creator's calendar in the Scriptures are quite different, though, than what we find in the Roman and the Gregorian calendar, which has prevailed in the world today, even to the world today, our modern society. And so, how is our Creator's calendar different? As one example, I'll get to the Scriptures later. We're going to get into the Hebrew to really go to the origins of his calendar, go a little bit to the Greek in the Brit Hadashah as well. So stay tuned for that. But for example, the Roman Gregorian calendar that we go by today, the middle of the night or the beginning of a day is midnight. And they determined that based upon the darkest time is how it originated, because the night is never black. It's never completely black or dark. There's always light shining from stars or even through our atmosphere and cloud system. There's always a little bit of light, whether it seems really dark and black or not. There's always a little bit of light. So the middle of the night is when it gets the darkest. But according to our Creator, the beginning and ending of a day is at the sundown, or when the sun sets. And we'll get into the Hebrew of that. In English we read, it says from evening to evening. But our Creator, has other differences in his calendar from our man-made calendars today. And so what are some of the differences? And we got New Year's coming, so with some meat in due season. If you're ready for some meat here, it's not just milky, easy, plain stuff. Although as we understand truth, it becomes more simple. We got to stick to the simplicity of the Scriptures and the interpretations, and try to make the whole word of our Creator, the inspired Word, agree and not have contradictions. So we have to look to His timing. Now, is His timing more important than your timing? Or my timing? Or our timing? Whose timing is more important? Or we can say appointed times. There's appointed times. We make appointments on our calendar, and we esteem some days higher than the others. But what does He esteem? And what has He made holy? What has He sanctified through the Scriptures, and even through, as we see, into the Brit Hadashah, the New Covenant writings? And so we're going to get into a little bit of that today and see what can be revealed through His holy Word. Because as we understand the physical realm, and those of us who are going to receive eternal salvation, we're going to return that, and we're no longer going to have flesh and blood. We'll be spirit, and timing, we're not going to be regulated by sunlight and moonlight and the three-dimensional material physical world that we have. So some people say, well, that's not important anymore, the physical world. Everything is spirit, and I am worshiping Him in spirit and in sincerity, and He knows my heart. And so with that mindset, we can come to the conclusions that are not what He intends us to come to. And so we can get into alignment with Him and not be on our own timing. And as we become physically and spiritually minded, we realize the physical, everything in the physical has purposes for the spirit world that we are to live in for all eternity. And so as we look to the physical in the way He wants us to, and become in alignment with Him, then He can trust us for all eternity with spiritual bodies that do not corrupt, that do not fade and deteriorate and die as we do in the human flesh. So let's get in alignment with Him. And right in the beginning of the book of Genesis, and for those of you who prefer the Hebrew, Bereshit. Bereshit, chapter 1. Getting into the week here of what we refer to as the creation week, or many of us understand it as the recreation, God reinstituting the earth and the solar system. Can be more than 6,000 years old as we understand the Hebrew properly, but not getting into that right now. If we jump down to verse 14, then our Creator said, "Let there be lights in the firmament." Now this is the atmosphere. As we look up into the atmosphere, let them be in the heavens to divide the day from the night. Now what lights in our firmament divide the day from the night? And let them be for signs and seasons and days and years. Or as we can say, even New Year's. How do we determine a new year? If they're up there for years, then we need to determine the beginning of each year to be able to count the years and the timing and the appointed times. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth. And so it was. And He made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. And He made the stars also. And it's interesting here that the sun and the moon and all the stars are like a huge clock in the sky that our Creator has given us to be able to count time, to be able to know the certain times of the year, the appointed times. And so let's look into the Hebrew, because there's a lot more in the Hebrew. As we translate knowledge from one language to another, there's always lost information to one degree or another. Even translators know this. Even, on the internet with translating, they know that a certain amount of information is always lost. So let's get back to the original language, try to understand it a little better. The word signs, He said, let them be for signs. That Hebrew word is auth. It's a Strong's number. If you like to look into the Strong's Concordance, we can prove this through even secular knowledge and concordances. And so we can see in number 226, 226 Strong's, it can mean a signal, a flag, a beacon, a mark, or a sign, or an omen. And so these are actually physical objects that you can see with the human eyes. Naked eyes. Flags we can see. Beacons and signs, and it's not something that's invisible. It's not something that can't be seen with the naked eye, according to this Hebrew word. Now it says, and they're made for seasons. Now this really causes many to overlook and see, well, okay, summer, winter, spring, and fall. Well, it's not talking about those kind of seasons. Again, get your Strong's Concordance, or whatever concordance or interpretation of language that goes into the Hebrew of the Holy Scriptures here. And that Hebrew word is moedim. In singular, it's moed, but dim, moedim, means plurality to it. Like we say Elohim, referring to, can refer to even more than just the Creator Himself. Also the angels are referred to as Elohim, and even in Scriptures. So going to Moedims, it means a fixed time. It can mean a season or a specific festival of assembly, as convened for a definite purpose. So there's a definite purpose behind these Moedims. Congregational meetings, a place meeting appointed beforehand. So it was appointed beforehand, a feast or festival. So our Creator's feast days, his festivals. Or it can be translated appointed times, as we're going to see the same Hebrew word translated later on here, that it can mean appointed times, like dates. He's setting dates. He wants to have a date with you. He's asking you out on a date. And more than just a single date, he wants more than one date. He wants to date us all year round, every year. But there's specific appointed times which have specific purposes and meanings, and they all point to his plan for humanity. And I want to get to that message sooner or later, how the 7 annual holy days and Shabbats are practically a chronological order plan from the crucifixion of the Lamb crucified, all the way to the Great White Throne Judgment. And there's 7 annual holy days. I'll get to that another message, but there's purposes behind these appointed times. If we go to Leviticus chapter 23, we'll find the same Hebrew word in verse 4. It says here, "These are the feasts of our Creator, holy convocations which you shall proclaim at their appointed times." Now, Moedims, at their Moedims, their appointed times. Same Hebrew word that we find in Genesis, Bereshit 1:14. So, the translators, even in the King James Version here, they didn't choose seasons here. They could have. It's another possible translation, but they saw here that appointed times. And so the sun and the moon were established for these things. And we can turn to Psalms 104. And in verse 19 he says, "He, the Creator, has appointed the moon for seasons." Now they choose seasons here in this translation, but it's, Moedims. He has appointed the moon to tell us appointed times, festivals. And so, as we understand the Scriptures more clearly, as we look into them a little more deeply, we see new moons always establish the first day of each month. And so, if you want to keep the appointed time, say the first day, the 14th day of the first month, according to his calendar, not January, but his calendar starts in the spring. We'll get into that in a little bit here. But, the first 14th day of the first month is the Pesach, the Passover. And so, how do you know what day that is if you don't know the first day of the first month? First, you have to know the month begins with a new moon. But now a year, that's a little bit more complicated. So we'll get into a little bit of that, years, because in Genesis 14, or 1:14, as I said, these appointed lights in the firmament are for years. Now, before we get more further into that, the lights in the firmament are not agricultural conditions. So what can we look to in regard to the lights in the firmament to determine the beginning of a year? Or how about the beginning of a day? Even that can be a little challenging and debatable within Scripture. Let's go to the beginning of a day. We know a month begins with a new moon, and we prove that with Yom Teruah, or as most Orthodox Jews refer to as Rosh Hashanah, where it's the first day of the 7th month is a new moon. So we can at least know that a new moon is the first day of a month, and there's other proofs of that. But let's go to the beginning of a day. And the most explicit proof of this that we can find in Scripture is in regard to Yom Kippur, as we say in Hebrew, which simply means in English, Day of Atonement. Yom is day, Kippur, atonement. And so we read that in Leviticus, same chapter 23, but going over to verse 32. So 23, reverse the numbers, 3:2, go to that verse. It says, "And it shall be to you a Shabbat, or a Sabbath of solemn rest. You shall Afflict your souls on the 9th day of the month at evening. From evening to evening you shall celebrate your Shabbat. And earlier, back in verse 27, it says that it is on the 10th day. So you start at evening at the end of the 9th day until evening. The next evening is the end of the 10th day. So from sunset to sunset, that Hebrew word is areb, and it could mean dusk. The root word is arab, to braid or intermingle. Can also be a translation. So at the horizontal sunset, we have an intermingling of light and darkness kind of merging together. And so it's not complete darkness or the middle of the night. There's a lot of debate. The rabbis have thought, some have concluded we need to see 3 stars, or some will say it's when the sun goes down on the mountain. Others will say, well, that could be different if we live in a valley, or in some place with really high mountains, and so they'll go by the horizontal sunset. But it's simply in Scripture, it's not explicit in that regard. I don't think he really has his pinpoint. He wants us to work hard and do what we can do, and have our works and have our pleasures, and do things that are according to His Word, and the freedom and liberty that we have in His Word, and then just stop right when it comes right to Shabbat. He wants us to slowly enter it in proper mindset and receive His appointed times, not rushing to the last minute like you're cramming for a final exam or something, midterm procrastination type situation. He wants us to merge and enter His appointed times with reverence and with respect for what He wants to teach us on these appointed times. So we see that now, evening to evening. Well, let's go to the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, in the book of Mark. Here we have Mark chapter 1, verse 32. We can see that evening, and for those who like to debate on, well, is evening, is it middle of the night, or when is it? In verse 32 it says, now at evening when the sun had set. So it's not the sunrise, as some people like to conclude as well, but the day begins at sunset. When the sun had set, they brought Him, Messiah, all who were sick. They brought to Him all who were sick and those who were demon-possessed. So here we see that evening, even in the Greek, has its roots back to the Hebrew in this regard, and the translators realize that evening is when the sun sets, and so it's important. Now, how about the beginning of a year? We can see when the beginning of a month, the beginning of a day, but how about the beginning of a year? And I'm not saying agricultural conditions are wrong. In fact, the name of the first month is Aviv, the month of Aviv, or Abib, which means green ears. So we do have to realize that there needs to be green ears, there needs to be the barley, and anyone who researches this can find it even from the rabbinical records that are 2,000 years old, how they were doing it. For the last 2,000 years, the rabbis and the sages have kept meticulous historical records of the calendar, of the Hebraic calendar, and they admit to changing it. Around 358, 359 A.D., Hillel II, not Hillel I. Hillel I was in the 1st century, around Messiah's time, and he was apparently a very good rabbi, very highly recognized and respected, similar to Gamaliel, who trained Paul, the Apostle Shaul. But Hillel II was a patriarch in the 4th century, a leading rabbinical sage who had his part involved with getting involved with converting the Hebrew calendar mathematically into a calculated calendar. And so, as brilliant as the Jewish people are with math and with calculations, they're brilliant. So he was able to mathematically calculate the monads, and but then they also changed the definition of a new moon, If you want to know more details on how the Orthodox Jewish calendar has evolved from the 4th century to about the 10th to 12th century, we have a free booklet on our website titled Yahweh's Sacred Calendar. You can Creator's Sacred Calendar. It's YHVH, and that's Yud He Vav He in the Hebrew letters. That's without the vowels, and so which can be pronounced in different dialects as Yahweh or Yehovah. If you think that name is too holy and it should be said as Adonai, which means Lord in Hebrew, please don't be offended by that. We're trying to use His name respectfully to magnify His name. And there's many scriptures that encourage us to know His name, that He will reveal His name to us. But getting back to His calendar here, how do we determine a New Year's Day? And agricultural conditions were used in the 1st century with the barley, of course. But the lights in the firmament, how can we determine a New Year's Day from the lights in the firmament? And what scriptures can reveal this to us? Well, there's only one that I know about explicitly, and it's even not all that explicit, a little ambiguous, I should say, if we admit on a scholarly level, that Exodus. If we turn to Exodus chapter 34, referring to the feast days landing in 3 times of the year. There's 7 annual ones, but they happen at 3 different time periods during the year. It says in verse 22, it says, "And you shall observe the Feast of Weeks of the first fruits of the wheat harvest." That's Pentecost, means count 50 in Greek, but the Hebrew is actually Shavuot, which means weeks. "And the Feast of Ingathering at the year's end." Now here in English, again, it will really mess us up if we just stick with the English. There's some lost information here. It's not the end of the year. The Feast of Ingathering, as everyone who studies this realizes, that it's referring to the Feast of Sukkot, or in English it means tabernacles. And that can also refer to the fall festivals, starting with Rosh Hashanah, as they call it. It's not really the beginning of a year, but it's Yom Teruah, which means Feast of Trumpets. And then there's Yom Kippur. And then we have Sukkot and the 8th day. So all those 4 holy days, Shabbats, happen in the fall time period. The Feast of Ingathering at the year's end. And most people understand ingathering is more specifically referring to as Sukkot, or tabernacles, beginning on the 15th day of the 7th month. And a year has much more than 7 months, so why does it say at the year's end? What does it mean, year's end? Because a month has to have at least 12 months in it. A year should have at least 12 months in it, and as a minimum. So we hear the Hebrew word is tekufah, similar to teshuvah, but it's tekufah, which means to turn, or a revolution of a cycle. Or, a lot of, we see in scriptures that our Creator works in circles and cycles. And let's see, this cat's trying to get into the video here. So we have here cycles, circles. Oh no, the Hebrew word can mean a revolution. And so here we see, what can we see as a full cycle? Getting back to Genesis 1:14, signs in the firmament, beacons, the sun and the moon and the stars. How do we determine a full cycle of a year? Now, what we refer to as a year is when the earth takes a full cycle around the sun, our closest star. And so that full cycle, how do we determine that from the firmament? Well, the only logical conclusion are the equinoxes. We can, in modern instruments, we can determine and pinpoint the equinox to be right around September, 21st, give or take a little there. And so we see the equinox is something, even in ancient times, they can tell when the days, an equinox is when the day and the night are equal in time duration. So it's the same amount of time of the night and the day are equal. And then all of a sudden either days become longer than the nights, as we see in the spring equinox, but the fall equinox, the days start getting smaller than the nights. And so even with the ancient sundials, they could determine real closely within just a couple days or so when the equinox was. But in the spring equinox would be, we don't find that in Scripture and referred to the Moedims or the appointed times. Usually it's referring to going to battle. When the armies go to battle, they wait till the spring equinox, the revolution, and they know that the days are going to become warmer after the spring equinox. And so when you're engaging in longer term battles and wars, you don't want to start it and try to fight through the winter, as Napoleon made the mistake and Hitler made the mistake of trying to go into foreign countries and invade powerful nations during the winter. Most in ancient times the Hebrews were smarter, and they waited till the spring equinox, in case these battles went on for a long time. But according to the Moedims, this is the only scripture we find, the appointed times. So we know that the Feast of Sukkot, or Tabernacles, must happen after the fall equinox. But the spring equinox is not so, like I said, we don't find it in Scripture in regard to the Moedims, but we do find the month of Aviv, green ears. Now the equinoxes are pretty much the same time of the year for the planet, just like sunsets and moonsets. Things happen within 24 hours. We can all be in unity around the world. So we can determine a new year, a new day, a new month. We, as for me and my house, our family, we go by local conditions because we determine our days based upon when the sun sets here. So the Sabbaths, the Shabbats, we go by the beginning and ending of a day, beginning and ending of a month, and a year is all happening within the same 24-hour period as over in Jerusalem. And you'll find others out there feel like Jerusalem has to be the higher priority. You can go to Michael Rood's website. He has a great calendar and exposes a lot of history on the changes and the evolutions of even the Hebrew calendar and trying to restore the original calendar. And he calls it the Creator's calendar. And it has a lot of great information and knowledge that is even going back with the Karaite Jews and knowledge that they've recorded. But all in my book, I get all my historical information from the rabbis, from the sages, from credible historical sources. The Encyclopedia Judaica in Jerusalem, the Jewish Quarterly Review, which goes back decades and quoting old sources. Even Philo, who was a credible Jewish historian, and Josephus, and we can see credible historians who understood the calendar of the first century. And so we want to restore the first century calendar because we know the Messiah was going by that, the Sanhedrin was going by that, and what we can prove through Scripture and the way it was done in the first century, well, if it was good enough for our Messiah, that should be good enough for us. And he kept the Moedims in Jerusalem based upon that. And so to think that everything has been changed or flipped upside down from what we can prove from history and non-biased history, why would people admit to changing the calendar if they they are the people who have held on to it, and they admit to changing it themselves? Just like as the Catholics admit to changing the Sabbath to Sunday, they admit it. They, even in the Catholic encyclopedias, you can find them confessing, admitting, and claiming to have the authority. So do the rabbinical leaders claim to have the authority to change the sacred calendar and the appointed times, the Moedims, change the definition of a new moon a little bit. It was used to go by observation, plenty of evidence and proof of that. Now it's based upon invisible dark moon. There's a 72-hour period where the moon does not give any light to the planet off the reflection of the sun. So they mathematically figure the middle of that. And as soon as a little crescent appears again, then it's always after sunset is when you first can see it with human eyes.